So for our knowledge burst today, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding insurance and some of the sort of systems of care that might fall under insurance. You can go to the next slide. So I want to just mention that every state is a little bit different in terms of some of the systems they have in place. Often Medicaid, which is a federal program, is going to cover and provide some of those supports and systems. But again, each state sort of navigates that a little differently. So we're going to focus a little more detail on Pennsylvania and New Jersey today, but also offer some general information and just want to remind everybody, if you're not from one of those states, you can find some more state-specific information probably through some local organizations, or you're welcome to follow up with us afterwards if you have kind of a more specific question. So Medicaid is a joint federal and state program, and although Medicaid does provide health coverage, it can also provide other different types of related services, including some of the behavioral health services that we were just talking about. Eligibility for these can vary a little bit from state to state. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania does have some sort of unique systems in place, but often at the state level, there's also different programs that a state can decide to put into place to provide support for individuals with a variety of different disabilities or diagnoses. Again, we'll be focusing really on autism today, but there are other services for other diagnoses as well. Go ahead. So I want to touch on Medicaid and waivers, because I know this is a question that comes up quite a bit, and give a little description about what that means if somebody talks about a waiver. So again, every state is going to have some system of Medicaid waivers. And what the waiver does is it provides funding for an individual with any specific qualifying condition. So again, we're talking about autism specifically today, but there are waivers for physical disabilities, for other kinds of health, kids who have maybe complex medical care needs. And the goal really is keeping children and adults in their community. So rather than sort of in the past where we had more institutionalization, the goal of a waiver is to really provide supports within the community and to help offer whatever services an individual might need. I do want to note that particularly in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but in many other states as well, waivers for autism are generally reserved more for adulthood. Now, this doesn't mean that a child can't be eligible. In fact, there are several waivers that a child could be eligible for. But one of the things that I like to caution is that often the care providers who are in network with able to accept funding from those waivers are going to be adult providers. And so we have some really nice systems of care for children in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey that if a family chooses to take a waiver, they may lose access to some of those children's services. All waivers are going to be based on eligibility and based on need. So I like to sort of just go over that slide because I know we get a lot of questions, and there are going to be waiver systems in place in every state, but we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things we have here locally as well. So go ahead to the next slide. So medical assistance, which is what we call Medicaid in Pennsylvania, specifically is a little bit different than what we find in a lot of the other states. So this is a medical insurance program. It's not really considered like a welfare benefit because in Pennsylvania, we have this as an entitlement for all children who have a qualifying diagnosis, and autism would be a qualifying diagnosis. So in our case today, at this point, this little girl might not qualify for medical assistance unless her parents met the income guidelines because she doesn't yet have a formal diagnosis. However, once she has her evaluation, if she does get a diagnosis of autism, then she'll become eligible for medical assistance. And that's going to be then regardless of her parents' income. So you can see here there's something called PH95, which is a Medicaid loophole in Pennsylvania. So it allows access for children with autism and other qualifying diagnoses. I like to also mention on here something that is called SSI, Supplemental Security Income. So this is not technically insurance. This is actually This is a sort of financial support that is going to be based on a family's income. But so if a child has a qualifying disability and a family meets the income guidelines, they might be eligible for this financial assistance as well. And anyone who qualifies for that is going to automatically receive the medical assistance as well. You can go ahead to the next slide. So some of the services, and this is again in Pennsylvania, that might be covered through medical assistance are what Judy was starting to talk about, which is our behavioral health ABA services. So in Pennsylvania, we have something called IBHS, which is Intensive Behavioral Health Services. And there is an ABA version, Applied Behavior Analysis, which is specific for children and teens who have autism. There's also general IBHS, so kids who don't have autism but may end up with other qualifying diagnoses and they're having behavioral needs can still qualify both for medical assistance and for some of these behavior support services. Sometimes we talked today about toilet training and how sometimes that can be a little challenging, might take a little bit longer for some of our children on the spectrum. Sometimes the cost of diapers can be covered for older children. Other kinds of perhaps assistive technology needs, co-pays. So we'll talk a little bit later on about how a family can have private or commercial insurance as well as medical assistance. And medical assistance might help supplement some of the co-pays that are part of the services they need. Also could potentially cover things like case management. And then there's other kinds of community activities that can be accessible. I also want to mention that some of the things, so Christy was talking about an occupational therapy evaluation. So if a child doesn't yet have a diagnosis, they may not have medical assistance, but things like occupational therapy and speech and language therapy are also services that can be covered through medical health insurance before you have a formal diagnosis, but just sort of through a traditional commercial plan. Go ahead to the next slide. And I did want to also mention, I'm going to go through the presentation and then we'll go through questions at the end, but please feel free to be typing those into the chat as we're going through so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. So this slide is just a resource about two of the main ways to apply for medical assistance in Pennsylvania. So again, if your child does have a diagnosis already of autism, I would encourage you to apply for medical assistance. And these are two of the ways to do that. There's a paper application and there's an online website. You'll need some of the documentation. For example, some of perhaps the evaluation, documenting the diagnosis. You'll need things, like birth certificate. You'll need, if your child has an IEP already or has had a school-based evaluation, which we talked about at our last session, you're probably going to want to include that as well. Go ahead to the next slide. So these are a couple different organizations here in Pennsylvania that can be really helpful for families who are trying to apply for medical assistance for their child. And any of these places can help answer questions and help make sure that you're on the right path for getting that in place. So now I'm going to touch a little bit on New Jersey, because I know we have a few New Jersey parents here as well. So in New Jersey, we're not going to have the same medical assistance program that's an entitlement for children as we do in Pennsylvania. Their state insurance that would fall under the Medicaid system is going to be based on families' income. However, they do have a medically needy program in New Jersey. So if a child has, for example, autism and several other needs, a family might still be eligible for some additional support through the Medicaid system to help cover the cost of some of those different services that their child might need. Go ahead. What New Jersey does have, which is not technically an insurance, but again is sort of a system of care, is called Perform Care. And Perform Care is a statewide children's system that offers many of the same kinds of behavioral health services and specific developmental disability services that we might see covered in Pennsylvania through medical assistance. So Perform Care is going to potentially use a family's medical insurance to help cover some of these services, but it's sort of a gateway to finding out what other kinds of more specialized services might be covered for your child with autism or children with other diagnoses as well. You can go ahead. So I also want to make a good point here that as of today, all states have taken some action to require insurance coverage for autism-specific services, including applied behavior analysis. Now, what that mandated coverage is will vary quite a bit from state to state and from specific insurance plan to plan, just as insurance plans kind of vary already from each other. So this is now we're talking about commercial or private insurance, specifically the kinds of insurance you might get from your employer. So I do want to make a note that private insurance plans or plans like purchased through the marketplace are not necessarily going to be obligated to provide these coverages. But any employer provided insurance is going to have some mandate to offer coverage for autism specific services. And that can cover some of the things like occupational therapy, speech therapy, ABA. The caveat is that we have to be able to say this service is specifically addressing some of my child's needs related to autism. So if a child also has a co-occurring diagnosis of anxiety, for example, and we're looking at a specialized anxiety treatment, that may not be covered by these autism coverage areas. Go ahead to the next. So when we're thinking about how we access this benefit, and again, this is really across the board in any state, wherever you live, I would encourage a family to call directly and ask a care manager what their autism benefit is. And this is really important because, again, it can vary greatly. So if your plan has copays or deductibles that are associated with any other kinds of medical care, for example, seeing a specialty care doctor, there's likely going to be a copay associated with some of these autism related services. And so that's where it's really important to get a good picture of what that looks like. Because, for example, if a family is trying to access something like speech therapy, for example, and maybe they're going once or twice a week, if the copay is going to occur every time, those costs can still add up pretty quickly. Also for things like ABA. So I think it's really important to make sure you have really detailed information about what that's going to look like and what sort of the maximum amount of funding is. And then I also want to make note here, again, in Pennsylvania, a family can have that commercial or private insurance and medical assistance as a supplement. And in those cases, that medical assistance might pick up any of those copays that would be happening. The key here is that then the providers that you're using have to be in network with both plans. So this can get a little complicated, but again, for our Pennsylvania families, this is a really important thing to try to sort of access and have understanding of, because the costs for some of these services can really add up if you're not making good use of the insurance coverage that you have. So this is one way that Pennsylvania tries to offer some support for families in covering the services that their child needs. Go ahead. Okay, so we'll pause there. And I know we got